Hello and welcome back to History for Today. One of the most fun things for historians is dealing with primary sources. And today in this digital age, I want to say something about actual books. Project Gutenberg, Google Books, and the Internet Archive have been incredibly valuable to historians and to me personally. I have personally downloaded hundreds of old books in PDF format that I've been able to read and highlight and annotate and link in my own note-taking system and to my own documents to enrich my research and to improve my understanding of the past. Google has been to places that I can't afford to go to and has scanned books that 25 years ago I probably wouldn't even have known existed. And my ability to mine all of these old texts with keyword searches means that I can use a wide variety of sources for a project like my search for all of the Massachusetts Darwins that I would never have had time to look into one by one for each of those individuals. But sometimes there is just no substitute for seeing and touching the actual book. In addition to the antiquarian coolness of handling something old, the physical properties of old books are sometimes very meaningful. I learned this lesson myself in person when I saw a little book almost a decade ago at the American Antiquarian Society in Worcester, Massachusetts. I had been interested in the life of Dr. Charles Knowlton, who had lived from 1800 to 1850 for a couple of years by then. He's the guy who's famous for publishing The Fruits of Philosophy, the first American book on birth control. Between 1832, when he first published it, and 1835, Knowlton was fined in Taunton, Massachusetts, imprisoned in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and then dragged into court again in Greenfield. To further illustrate the radical nature of Knowlton's birth control message and the social forces that had opposed it, over 50 years later, Londoners Charles Bradlaugh and Annie Besant were tried at the Queen's Bench for republishing Knowlton's exact book. There's a copy of The Fruits of Philosophy available on Google, full text. It was printed in 1891 in San Francisco, California, a reprint of Bradlaugh and Besant's reprint, suggesting that Knowlton's material remained interesting and valuable for generations after its initial publication. I thought this text had already told me all that I needed to know about Knowlton's book, but I asked to see the originals at the American Antiquarian Society out of a purely geeky desire to hold something that old and something that Knowlton himself might once have handled. The Antiquarian Society's 2 copies of The Fruits of Philosophy arrived at the librarian's table in small cardboard boxes. As I carried them back to my desk, I thought that they might contain fragments of the books or torn pages or something. When I opened the first box, I was surprised to find inside it a complete palm-sized book with a blue cloth hardcover. In an aha moment, I remembered that when Knowlton was released from prison in Cambridge in 1883, he made a speech in which he referred to The Fruits of Philosophy as a little book. Later, in his 1835 article on what he called the excitement in Ashfield, when they were trying to get him tried again in Greenfield, Massachusetts, he again said that he had been persecuted for publishing a little book. It had never occurred to me that he was speaking literally, but it makes sense. The Fruits of Philosophy was contraband when it was published. Knowlton was fined, imprisoned, and continually harassed for several years after its printing. Abner Kneeland, the publisher of the Boston Investigator, was tried and imprisoned for blasphemy, and people familiar with his case at the time understood that he had been targeted for his role in republishing the 1834 edition of The Fruits of Philosophy, and then for advertising it constantly in the Investigator. It's completely obvious to me in this context why buyers of the book would have wanted it to be little, pocket-sized, palmable, and easily concealable. But the obvious had never occurred to me, looking at the Google scan of the 1891 reprint. The threadbare cover of the Antiquarian Society's 1832 edition and the very low production values. The title page has a faint double strike on it. also tell us about the way that the first edition of the Fruits of Philosophy was produced. It was almost a self-published work. Knowlton did use a printer, but he paid for its publication himself. And also tells us about how it was probably passed from hand to hand secretly by women who had decided by the 1830s that they ought to have some say in their reproductive lives. It's easy to imagine women, and sometimes maybe even their husbands, palming the little book and handing it off literally under the noses of the church and civil authorities who were trying to suppress it. The 1834 Knowlton edition used slightly higher quality type. Abner Knowlton, after all, was publishing a newspaper, and paper and binding, but significantly it retained the tiny dimensions of the original version. We're very lucky that a few of these books have survived to tell the story that surrounds but is not included in the printed words. And finally, let me just say thank goodness for the American Antiquarian Society, founded in 1812 or 1813 by Isaiah Thomas, another early printer of Massachusetts. So I hope people have found that interesting. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you again next time.